There is a particular kind of stillness that exists just before everything changes. London in 1665 carried that stillness, in the way smoke hung over rooftops in the early morning, the way the Thames moved slowly under the weight of laden barges, the way the city breathed, deeply, unevenly, with the labored rhythm of something alive and overcrowded and entirely unaware of what was coming. To stand at the edge of that city would be to stand before one of the most extraordinary concentrations of human energy in the known world. London in the mid-17th century held somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 souls, a figure that made it the largest city in the British Isles by an enormous margin, and one of the largest in all of Europe, rivaling Paris and Amsterdam in both scale and economic gravity. It had grown relentlessly through the previous century, doubling and then doubling again, pulling laborers from the countryside, merchants from the continent, sailors from every coastline that traded with England, and refugees from religious and political upheaval across Europe. The city had never been designed for this. It had simply accumulated, layer upon layer, like sediment in a riverbed. That accumulation was visible in everything. In streets too narrow for two carts to pass. In houses that leaned out over those streets until neighboring upper floors nearly touched. In churchyards where the dead had been buried so many times over that the ground had risen noticeably above street level. London was a city built in wood, heated by coal, lit by tallow candles, and watered by a river that also served as its main sewer. It was, by any rational modern standard, dangerous. But to those who lived in it, it was simply home. A place of enormous possibility and grinding daily struggle, of wealth flashing past in gilded coaches and poverty pooling in the shadowed courtyards behind. The year 1665 arrived, with the city still intoxicated by its own restoration. Charles II had returned to the throne just 5 years earlier, in 1660, ending the austere republic of the interregnum and bringing with him a court culture that was theatrical, pleasure-seeking, and conspicuously luxurious. The theaters had reopened, the alehouses never really closed, the Royal Exchange was thriving, and yet beneath that energy ran a current of unease. Plague had struck cities in the Low Countries, and the rumors from the Dutch ports were not good. London watched and went about its business and hoped. It would not be spared. To understand London in 1665, you need to understand it not as a collection of buildings, but as a network of flows. The city moved constantly, in every direction, at every hour. The Thames was the arterial system. Everything came in by water. Coal from Newcastle, grain from East Anglia, timber from Scandinavia, spices and silks from the east via the great trading companies, wine from France and Portugal, saltfish from Iceland. The river was crowded with vessels from early morning. The wide-bellied colliers anchored midstream, the flat-bottomed lighters ferrying goods between ships and quayside, the wherries darting between banks carrying passengers who had no patience for the chaotic streets. The watermen, thousands of them, licensed by the Crown, were the taxi drivers of their age, calling from their boats, negotiating fares, complaining about the weather and the competition from coaches. Their world was entirely aquatic. They knew every eddy, every sandbank, every mooring, and they knew the river's moods as intimately as farmers knew their fields. On land, the flows were denser and less orderly. The main arteries, Cheapside, Lombard Street, Cornhill, Gracechurch Street, were rivers of human movement from before dawn until well after dark. Apprentices ran errands. Porters carried impossible loads on their backs, cleared a path by sheer momentum. Fishwives walked from Billingsgate before the city had fully woken, their baskets heavy, their calls already beginning. Carriers brought goods in from the surrounding counties along roads that were, in wet weather, close to impassable. Deeply rutted, churned by iron-wheeled wagons, treacherous with mud. Yet they came, from Essex and Kent, from Surrey and Hertfordshire, bringing animals to the livestock markets, vegetables and fruit to the smaller markets scattered through the parishes, milk from farms close enough to the city edge that the cows were sometimes walked in daily. The markets themselves were not just commercial spaces, but social ones. They were where information traveled, where gossip became news, where prices were set and credit extended and debts negotiated. A merchant standing at his stall on Cheapside in the morning might know by midday that a ship had been lost in the channel, because 3 different people would have mentioned it, each with slightly different details, each having heard it from someone else. London communicated at the speed of conversation. The churches, and there were over 100 of them within the city walls, punctuated the day with bells. They marked the hours, called people to prayer, announced deaths, rang in celebration. In a city without mechanical clocks in every household, the church bells were the shared pulse of time. You knew where you were in the day by which bells you could hear from where you stood. If you were to enter the city from the south, from Southwark, from the road that ran down through Kent toward the Channel ports, you crossed by London Bridge, and there was no other choice. For 5 centuries, it had been the only fixed crossing of the Thames in London, and it wore that responsibility with a certain ungainly grandeur. The bridge in 1665 was nothing like a modern reader might imagine. It was not a clean span of stone. It was a street. It was approximately 300 meters long and lined on both sides with buildings, houses, shops, a chapel, a tavern, that had been built directly onto the bridge's structure over the previous centuries, so that in many sections the buildings overhung both sides of the river, reducing the road between them to a narrow, shadowed passage where 2 carts could barely pass. The structures were 4 and 5 stories tall, timber-framed, projecting outward at each floor in the medieval fashion so that the upper stories nearly touched across the gap. Walking through London Bridge was like walking through a tunnel with open ends. The light was limited, the noise was compressed, the smell was intense. The water beneath the bridge was dramatic in its own right. The 19 stone piers that supported it were fitted with timber starlings, protective enclosures around their bases, that reduced the flow of water through the arches so severely that the river on the upstream side could be a full 2 feet higher than on the downstream side. When the tide was flowing strongly, the rush of water through the narrow arches was fast enough to be dangerous. Shooting the bridge, as it was called, was something experienced watermen did with caution, and less experienced ones sometimes did only once. Passengers often disembarked from their wherries on one side, walked across, and boarded another boat on the other. At the Southwark end of the bridge stood the great stone gate, and on its top, visible to anyone arriving from the south, were the heads of traitors and criminals, displayed on pikes as a statement of royal authority. It was a tradition of long standing, unremarkable to Londoners, jarring to foreign visitors. The Venetian diplomat who passed through in 1618 counted 30 heads and noted the sight in his dispatch home with a kind of careful neutrality. By 1665, the practice continued, though with somewhat less frequency. Arriving from the Kent Road, with the Surrey hills behind you and the city ahead, the bridge was your threshold, and it declared its terms plainly. The shops on the bridge sold specialty goods, haberdashery, fine fabrics, imported pins and thread. It was considered a reasonably fashionable address compared to the surrounding riverside streets. Merchants' wives shopped there. Apprentices were sent with lists. The bridge had its own tiny ecosystem. The residents woke to the sound of water beneath their floors, lived with the constant movement of people through their street, and had grown so accustomed to the motion of the structure. It flexed slightly under heavy loads, and during ice floods it shook as debris hit the piers, that they no longer noticed it. To walk east from London Bridge and north along Gracechurch Street into the heart of the city was to arrive eventually at the Royal Exchange, the building that, more than any other, embodied London's commercial identity in this period. It had been built a century earlier, in the 1560s, by the merchant and financier Thomas Gresham, who had seen the Great Bourse of Antwerp and decided that London needed one equally grand. The Exchange occupied a large quadrangular site just off Cornhill, its principal facade presenting a gatehouse with a tower topped by a large gilded grasshopper, the Gresham family symbol. You entered through the gate and found yourself in an open courtyard surrounded by arcaded galleries on 2 levels. The ground floor divided into walks where merchants gathered by trade. The Virginia Walk for those dealing in American commodities, the Spanish Walk for Iberian trade, the Scots Walk, the Italian Walk. Each walk had its regulars, its established protocols for negotiation, its understood hierarchies. The upper gallery was a shopping arcade, small lock-up units rented by retailers selling luxury goods, milliners, jewelers, booksellers, sellers of maps and prints. It was a place where women of the merchant and gentry classes came to shop and be seen, where the boundary between commerce and sociability was deliberately blurred. The building was designed to impress. Its proportions were generous by London standards, the courtyard large enough to feel open to the sky even when crowded, which it usually was between midday and 2 in the afternoon, when the Exchange officially opened for business. What happened there was partly formal trade, bills of exchange negotiated, insurance contracts underwritten, cargo lots bought and sold before the ships even arrived, and partly the management of information. Merchants gathered not just to transact, but to learn. Which ships had come in, which were overdue, what prices were like in Lisbon or Hamburg, whether the wars in the Low Countries were threatening the trade routes. In an age before newspapers were established as a daily institution, the Exchange functioned as a news exchange as much as a commodity one. A merchant who missed a day there might miss intelligence that cost him money. In the spring of 1665, those conversations had taken on an edge. The Second Anglo-Dutch War had begun, and Dutch vessels, once regular presences in the Thames, were now prizes to be taken. English merchants were calculating risks, rerouting shipments, hedging their bets. The war was not abstract. It touched the prices of everything. Any account of London in this period must reckon with St. Paul's, the great medieval cathedral that stood at the western end of Cheapside and dominated the city's skyline with the ambiguity of something unfinished. The spire of Old St. Paul's had been destroyed by lightning and fire in 1561, over a century before 1665, and had never been replaced. The cathedral in 1665 was, therefore, a massive Romanesque and Gothic structure, missing its crowning element, rising to a flat-topped crossing tower that gave the building a truncated, slightly awkward profile when seen from a distance. It was still enormous, one of the largest churches in Northern Europe by footprint, with a nave that was over 175 meters long. But years of neglect, wartime disruption under the Commonwealth, and the complex politics of post-Restoration church finance had left it in a state of dignified disrepair. Parts of the interior were crumbling. The portico added by Inigo Jones in the 1630s, a classical screen on the west facade, looked incongruous against the medieval stonework behind it. What happened inside St. Paul's was not entirely what you might expect from a cathedral. The nave, Paul's Walk, as it was commonly called, had for generations served as a kind of covered public space as much as a sacred one. Merchants used it to meet and conduct business when the weather made the royal exchange unpleasant. Servants looking for employment gathered in specific aisles to be hired. Lawyers consulted clients in the shadows of the columns. The cathedral authorities disapproved, periodically issued prohibitions, and were largely ignored. The building was too large, too central, and too habitual to be controlled. Outside, the churchyard was the center of the London book trade. The booksellers and printers whose small shops clustered around the cathedral had established St. Paul's churchyard as the publishing district of England. Titles were registered, sermons printed, pamphlets sold, almanacs distributed. The intellectual output of the kingdom flowed through those small premises pressed up against the old stone walls. On a busy afternoon, a visitor could buy a copy of a sermon preached that morning, a political broadside, an account of a sea battle, and a new work of poetry, all within 50 meters. In early 1665, Christopher Wren had already submitted preliminary proposals for the repair and renovation of the cathedral. The commission appointed to oversee the work met in April of that year, just months before everything would become moot. Within 18 months, the cathedral would be a gutted shell, and Wren would be designing not a repair, but a replacement. If London had a spine, it was Cheapside, the wide street running east to west through the heart of the city, connecting the Royal Exchange and the financial district to the western precincts near St. Paul's. It was, by London standards, generously wide. Wide enough for market stalls down the center, for coaches and carts to pass on either side, for crowds to form without entirely blocking movement. That width made it extraordinary in a city where most streets were tight enough that neighbors on opposite sides could lean out of upstairs windows and conduct a conversation without raising their voices. The name came from the Old English cheap, trade, bargain, and trade was what Cheapside had always been about. The street was organized by trade in the medieval tradition, with specific products concentrated in specific areas. The poulterers near poultry, the goldsmiths along the south side of the street in a row of substantial shops that would have been familiar to Chaucer. The goldsmiths of Cheapside were not merely craftsmen, but early bankers. They accepted deposits, issued receipts that circulated as a form of currency, and made loans. The shop signs above their doors, gilded and painted, projecting out over the street, advertised not just goods, but financial services. Walking down Cheapside in the early morning was a sensory experience of considerable intensity. The street was never quiet after dawn. The market stalls set up their trestles before full light, the sellers calling their goods in the particular rhythmic cadences that London market traders had refined over generations. The smell shifted by section. Fresh bread from the bakers near the West End, the rawer smells of meat and fish from the Middle Market, the warmer, dustier smell of dry goods and fabric toward the east. Underfoot, the cobblestones were wet with what had been thrown or spilled from the houses above. It was still common practice to empty household waste from upper-floor windows into the street, with only the traditional warning cry of "Gardy Loo" as notice to those below. In wet weather, the kennel, the central drainage channel, ran with a dark mixture of rainwater and everything else. In dry weather, the dust was thick enough to coat clothing within minutes. This was simply the texture of urban life, accepted as the price of living at the center of things. On summer evenings, the street had a different character. Business had slowed. Apprentices sat on doorsteps. Householders stood in doorways taking the air. The light came low and golden between the buildings, catching the upper stories, leaving the street level in relative shadow. Children played in the margins. Dogs moved through the crowds with the unhurried authority of creatures who understood the rhythm of the place. At the eastern edge of the city, where the walls met the river, the tower stood in a posture of permanent authority. It was already ancient in 1665. The White Tower at its core had been built by William the Conqueror nearly 6 centuries earlier, and that antiquity was part of its effect. The tower did not need to announce its power. It simply existed, massive and whitewashed, its walls meeting the river on one side and the city on the others, a structure that had outlasted every political convulsion the country had experienced. In 1665, the tower served multiple functions simultaneously, as it had for centuries. It was a royal palace, though rarely used as one by now. Charles II had been formally invested there before his coronation procession in 1661, the last monarch to use the tower in that way. It was an armory, holding enormous quantities of weapons and gunpowder in its storehouses. It was the royal mint, where the nation's coinage was struck from gold and silver brought in by merchants and returned as standardized coin. It was a menagerie, where lions, a leopard, and other exotic animals were kept and displayed to visitors who paid a small fee. It was a record repository, holding state papers and legal documents going back centuries. And it was a prison, perhaps the most famous prison in England, the place where those who had fallen from royal favor or been accused of treason were confined under conditions that varied from comfortable house arrest to genuine severity, depending on the nature of their offense and the degree of official displeasure. The yeoman warders who guarded the tower were a permanent fixture of the place, armed, uniformed in the distinctive Tudor livery that they still wore, part ceremonial and part functional. Visitors came to the tower regularly, to see the menagerie, to view the crown jewels in their strong room, to look at the armory. It was, in a peculiar way, a tourist attraction as well as a seat of power. From the river, the tower presented its best face, the massive bulk of the White Tower rising above the outer curtain walls, the turrets at each corner, the water gate, Trader's Gate, through which prisoners were brought in by boat, passing directly from the Thames into the tower's custody without passing through the city at all. That gate opened directly onto the water, and at high tide, the Thames lapped at its threshold. In winter fogs, the tower disappeared from view on the river, becoming a sound rather than a sight. The distant rattle of chains, the cry of ravens, the hammer of the mint somewhere in its depths. Cross back to London Bridge and walk south, and you enter a different world. Southwark lay outside the jurisdiction of the City of London Corporation, across the bridge and technically in Surrey, a fact that had shaped its character profoundly. For generations, Southwark had been the place where London kept its entertainments and its industries that the city proper preferred not to have within its walls. The theaters had been here, the Globe, the Rose, the Swan. Though most were gone or dormant by 1665, casualties of the Commonwealth's suppression of public performance. Some would reopen, but the great Elizabethan theater district that had made Southwark famous was already a memory, its sites built over or derelict. What remained was the broader tradition of entertainment. Bear baiting had been common here, and some venues continued. The taverns of Southwark were numerous and well patronized, serving travelers arriving from the south, workers from the tanneries and breweries, watermen resting between fairs. The tanneries, in fact, were what you noticed first if you arrived in Southwark from the Bridge Road on a warm day. The processing of hides required soaking in large vats of oak bark solution, and the smell of this process, sharp, animal, insistent, hung over the southern bank of the Thames with particular tenacity. It was work that the city preferred to keep at a distance, and in Southwark it had found its natural home, along with the glassmakers, the dyers, the felt hat makers, the vinegar brewers, industries that were noisy or smelly or both, that needed space and water access and proximity to the city without being inside it. The Marshalsea prison stood here too, on the Borough High Street, a debt prison primarily, where those who could not pay their creditors were confined until arrangements were made. Unlike the Tower, the Marshalsea was not a place of political drama. It was a place of financial misfortune, and its inmates included at various times people from every level of society, from ruined merchants to skilled craftsmen who had overextended themselves. The prison operated on a peculiar economy. Inmates who had any resources could pay for better accommodation and relative freedom of movement within the walls. Those who had nothing lived in the common wards, supported by charity and by the contributions of more fortunate fellow prisoners. The spring of 1665 was dry and warm, and by May, the reports from the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, outside the western city walls, had become impossible to dismiss. The bills of mortality, those weekly tallies of London deaths organized by cause, began to show entries under a particular heading that no Londoner wanted to see. The plague had visited London before, repeatedly, in living memory and in the deeper memory that communities maintain through stories told and behaviors passed down. It was not unknown, but each return brought with it the same mixture of denial, rationalization, and gradual dawning recognition that this time was real. In June, the official count of plague deaths rose sharply. By July, it was unmistakable. By August, at the epidemic's peak, the weekly bills were recording over 6,000 deaths in a single week, in a city where the normal weekly death toll from all causes was perhaps 300 or 400. Those who could leave, left. The court moved to Oxford. The wealthier merchants and professionals took their families to country estates or to the homes of relatives in smaller towns. The Royal Exchange grew quiet. The streets of the wealthier parishes, the well-built houses of Cornhill and Cheapside, were emptied of their most prosperous inhabitants, while the poorer parishes in the east and south remained full, partly because the poor had nowhere to go, and partly because the epidemic was running most fiercely through the overcrowded districts where the housing was worst and the water supply most contaminated. The practice of marking infected houses with a painted red cross, a mark of quarantine intended to warn passers-by and confine the sick with their families, transformed the visual landscape of the city's neighborhoods. Watchmen were appointed to enforce the confinement, sitting at the doors of marked houses through the long summer days and nights, preventing movement in or out. The theory behind the quarantine was imperfect. The role of fleas and rats in transmitting the disease was entirely unknown. But the instinct to isolate the sick was sound, and the enforcement, however imperfect, represented a genuine public health response. Samuel Pepys, who remained in London throughout the epidemic and recorded it in his diary with a characteristic mixture of practical concern, personal fear, and compulsive social observation, noted the emptiness of the streets, the abandoned houses, the grass beginning to grow in the less frequented lanes. He continued to attend to his work at the Navy Office, continued to entertain, continued to pursue his various private pleasures, and continued to note the rising toll in the bills of mortality with the kind of attention that was itself a form of courage, the courage of not looking away. By the autumn, the epidemic was subsiding. The cold weather helped, reducing the activity of the fleas that carried the bacterium from rats to humans, though no one understood this mechanism. Londoners returned to their city gradually, cautiously, checking houses that had been shut up, assessing damage, calculating losses. The total death toll from the Great Plague of 1665 is estimated at somewhere between 68,000 and 100,000 people, roughly a fifth of London's entire population. The city absorbed this and went on. It had absorbed plagues before. What it could not know was that within the next 12 months, it would face something of a different kind entirely. Not a biological catastrophe, but a structural one. A fire that would begin in a bakery on Pudding Lane in the early hours of September 2nd, 1666, and would burn for 4 days, destroying 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, and the great medieval cathedral of St. Paul's. Everything that plague had left standing, fire would largely take. To walk through London today is to walk through the archaeology of that loss. The Great Fire of 1666 erased medieval London with a thoroughness that no later development, not the Blitz, not post-war reconstruction, not the office towers of the 20th and 21st centuries, has quite matched for sheer decisiveness. The street plan survives. The courses of Cheapside and Cornhill and Lombard Street still follow the lines they followed in 1665, because the rebuilding after the fire, though it introduced better materials and wider streets, could not entirely remake the ancient skeleton of lanes and passages that centuries of use had worn into the ground. You can walk those streets today and understand, with a little effort of imagination, something of the spatial logic that shaped daily life in that lost city. The monument, designed by Wren and Robert Hooke and completed in 1677, stands near the point where the fire began. Its height of 61 meters precisely equal to the distance from its base to the bakery on Pudding Lane. It is one of the most direct acts of memory in the city. A column that is also a measurement, an architectural gesture that encodes the fact of the fire into the landscape. Wren's churches, the 51 parish churches rebuilt after the fire, of which about 23 survive in their original form, are the most complete and beautiful legacy of that rebuilding. They stand as individual expressions of a single, sustained effort of design, each slightly different, each adapted to its awkward city plot, each lit by the tall windows that Wren favored and which fill the interiors with the kind of clear, rational light that the 17th century associated with reason and good order. St. Bride's on Fleet Street, St. Mary Le Bow on Cheapside, St. Stephen Walbrook behind the Mansion House. These are not ruins or monuments, but working churches, still standing in streets that, in certain lights and from certain angles, carry something of the quality of the rebuilt city. The Thames is still there, of course, though transformed beyond what any 1665 waterman would recognize. Embanked in the 19th century, its medieval foreshore buried under the Victoria Embankment, its wharves long since converted to offices and restaurants and promenades, its watermen replaced by the overground and the tube. The river runs where it always ran, but the relationship between city and water has been entirely restructured. You can stand on the embankment and look across to Southwark and see, roughly, what the view looked like. The opposite bank, the bridges, the dome of St. Paul's, Wren's dome, not the medieval tower. But the smells and sounds and activity that would have made that view meaningful in 1665 are entirely gone. London Bridge itself was replaced in the 19th century, and the current bridge is a plain concrete structure of the 1970s, entirely without the character of its predecessor. The houses, the shops, the starlings, the heads on the gate, all gone, first by demolition and then by replacement. Southwark Cathedral, however, survives. The choir and retro choir of the medieval church of St. Mary Overy, which served the parish of Southwark, escaped the fire and remains standing, beautifully preserved, a direct physical link to the world of 1665 and far earlier. To sit in that choir on a quiet afternoon is to occupy space that a Southwark waterman or a Bankside tanner would have known. The Tower of London endures completely, its outline on the river unchanged, its stones carrying the weight of every century they have witnessed. The yeoman warders still wear their Tudor livery. The ravens still live within the walls. The crown jewels are still there, in a different strong room. The continuity is almost disorienting, given how much around it has changed. There is something that moves me about this particular city in this particular year. The year before the fire, the year of the plague, the year when everything that had accumulated over centuries was living out its last chapter without knowing it. The wooden houses on London Bridge, the booksellers' stalls in St. Paul's churchyard, the goldsmith signs along Cheapside swinging in the winter wind. All of it carrying the weight of living history. All of it less than 2 years from obliteration. I would like, someday, to stand on that bridge, to walk from the Southwark end through the shadowed passage between the overhanging houses, to hear the rush of water through the arches below, to emerge on the north side into the noise and smell and light of the medieval city, to follow Cheapside west toward the truncated tower of St. Paul's, to sit in the gallery of the Royal Exchange and listen to the low murmur of commerce being conducted in half a dozen languages, to watch the evening settle over the river while the watermen call for fares and the church bells begin their rounds. Those streets are still there, beneath everything. The angles are different now. The scale has changed. The materials are stone and glass and steel, rather than timber and plaster and thatch. But the ground is the same ground. The curve of the river is unchanged. On certain winter mornings, when the light comes in low over the water and the city has not quite woken, something in the air carries a quality, still, observant, holding its breath, that might, if you were willing to feel it, remind you of a city that once existed here in its entirety, busy and alive and entirely unaware of what was coming. That glimpse, however brief, is enough to make you want to look longer. The past, even reconstructed and approximated and imagined into being, has a gravity all its own. And London in 1665, crowded, wooden, brilliant, flawed, plague-ridden, and magnificent, pulls at something that refuses to let go.